So I'm here today, honored to be with David Cayley. Um, and I just actually stumbled a couple of weeks ago upon your work, and I kind of feel like I feel a little bit bad about this because I'm not, I'm not linear in my discovery of things. So, but I'm really grateful that you're taking some of your time, David, to have this conversation with me. So, David is based in Toronto. Is an author and a broadcaster. That was, I guess, before the podcasters, right?
Yes.
And author of several books on different philosophers, and René Girard and George Grant, among others. But mostly, I wanted to talk about Ivan Illich, which you've published a book recently. Also, well, it was the second one, right?
Well, I guess third, really, since there
During,
was Ivan Illich in Conversation in 1992, and then there was The Rivers North of the Future in 2005,
right.
And then there was this big poem that you just displayed in 2021.
I haven't read it. I'm ordering it right now. As I said, I'm a bad student. I kind of I'm not linear. You've also, as we said, prepared material and broadcasted on the CBC for what, over 30 years?
Well, yeah, 40. I started at the CBC in 1971 and retired in 2012. So that's 41 years.
Wow. Eh? And it kind of shows to me because I'm in Quebec, you're in Toronto, and here we call it the two solitudes, those kind of two parallel worlds that we're so close, and yet we have so much common interest, and among others, the material that you've published touched upon, ecology, culture, religions. I really stumbled upon the nature of science, which I was really excited to talk to you about, and especially that latest piece that where you've addressed the pandemic with the point of view of Ivan Illich. I thought that this was genius piece, and I would be curious to hear you on that as well.
Okay, good.
You've done several lectures and also aborted the theme of the theme of prison and reconciliation, right? The prison system.
Yeah. Yes.
And also got awarded. And one of them that caught my attention was an honorary doctorate in sacred letters.
I know. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, I was scared. What is sacred letters? My podcast is called Sacrum. So I was like, oh wow, okay, we're.
It's not how I introduce myself. How do you do? I'm an honorary doctor of sacred letters.
Do you?
But it was a very sweet occasion at a little theological college at Laurentian University.
Yeah.
So I'm pleased to remember it.
My first question that kind of sets the table for this conversation is, do you consider yourself as a Christian intellectual?
Wow. Well, sure. Why shouldn't I? I mean, if you accept that we don't really know what Christianity is, then I think one should accept the name if one is a seeker after what it is to become. So you can read various thinkers in that light. I think if Ivan Illich is taken seriously with his idea that Western civilization is a corruption of Christianity, a transformation of it in perverse directions, a misappropriation in the sense that it has begun something of a seemingly impossible dynamism, right?
Yes.
Which threatens the earth, really, then there's a strong implication there that one needs to go back and re-understand this thing. And also, of course, if Illich is to be taken seriously, that we live in a kind of congealed Christianity, right? That this that our civilization cannot be otherwise explained cogently, which I think, then we're all Christians.
Yes.
And the fact that the leading edge of this, what thinks of itself as the leading edge now, hotly denies that it's Christian and repudiates Christianity, and indeed, in some of its wings, burns down churches, right?
Mm.
And dresses in sackcloth and ashes and repents of everything that Christianity ever was or ever meant, then to that extent, people are living in a mystification. They're living unaware of what they are. If and that has so many degrees to it, right? So, I mean, just to finish the thought, I mean, another thinker quite different than Illich that is important to me is Carl Gustav Jung, psychoanalyst, who says that we're in need of a new understanding, but we don't have it, right? That what he calls the God image within us is changing. It's not a constant. It's not always the same, right? Whether God in itself is always the same is a question we could ask, but what is here changes, right? Which is a plausible reading of the Bible, since the God that Jesus calls his Father is plainly not the same God who's in Genesis. So we're in the midst of changes, and we don't know their outcome. So why not accept that in a certain sense we're all Christians? I don't mean Muslims are Christians or Jews are Christians.
Yes.
I mean that we have this inheritance that everyone is living in, and if we take it seriously and we really want to investigate what its roots and sources are, I would say yes. So then I'm a Christian intellectual, I admit it.
I guess it's interesting for me to start with this question because, on one hand, as you've outlined, Western civilization could have never spread out as it did without the myth of Christianity, right? And on the other hand, we've reached a point where, academia, for instance, and the intellectuals are kind of stuck in this kind of materialistic paradigm of atheism, and secularity, and which is also kind of like the spearheading of a myth. But I feel that the intellectuals, for me, that are the most interesting is the ones that are almost like contemplative in a, like you've outlined also, in the mystery of an unfolding, that we don't have the answers, and the mind cannot get all of the answers. We need to look somewhere else, or to be open to somewhere else, and the ideal, the sculpture of the Christ, or the depiction of the Christ pointing towards the heart, the sacred heart. I feel that this is where, like, intellectual that call themselves Christian can also be connected with this heart. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does.
And a friend that we have in common, which kind of rings a bell, I'm just going to present the book here, Robert Vachon, which I met at the Intercultural Institute. He passed away in 2020. Peace be upon him. But we have this, he was also a priest. and just like Ivan Illich for a while, right? And he was a man of such a curiosity, and like still he had his own faith, but he was like in a very rare mind, I would say, of curiosity towards the whole of humanity and in search of the Christ within all traditions, all cultures, right? Hinduism,
Mhm.
Buddhism, even atheists, you know, he was like looking for the Christ everywhere. As a, and how would you describe this Christ? Because maybe Illich also, just to make the parallel, was also in a certain position like this, where he was rooted in Christianity. He was saying that, you know, the church might be a whore, but it's still his mom, right? That's one of his quotes.
Right.
But so he was like embracing the myth of the Christ, and still he was in an intercultural research towards, you know, having a dialogue with other cultures. So how would you describe the Christ like attitude or that these intellectuals hold? Does that make sense as a question?
Well, I I think when you say these intellectuals, of course, they're all quite different from one another, and that's interesting. So Illich is much more discreet, much more reserved. Uh, he he says he says nothing about the unknown Christ of Hinduism. To take Raimon Panikar's phrase, um, he's just a much more discreet, withheld thinker altogether. Um, so I don't know if they're all the same, and I think that the differences actually are interesting and inspiring.
Mm,
But I think what you can say of Ivan is that he throws his bridge or to the very outer limit of what has been Christianity, right? If Simone Weil says that she finds her place, this is a letter to the priest with whom she had a dialogue in Vichy, France, before she left France in 1942, I guess it was. Father Perron, and he wants her to be baptized, and she is explaining why she hesitates at this step, and says that she finds her place at the intersection of Christianity and everything that is not Christianity.
mm,
So, in other words, I mean, that's posing. I nearly fell down when I read that sentence. She's posing, that says everything in a way. But Ivan is there, camped there, just inside the wall, trying to think what Christianity has been, and not trying to go beyond that. Right?
mm,
Uh, he wouldn't have dared to use the word like myth, as you just used,
mm,
because he conceives this as a personal relationship uh, by which he's constrained also. Um, so uh, you find quite a different perspective in Robert Vachon. You find again a different perspective in Raimon Panikkar, although I think they're close. They're closer, Vachon and Panikkar.
yeah.
So there's a lot of differences. Um, um, and Ivan did not speak readily of his faith at all.
Mm,
He manifested it, but he did not speak readily of it, and sometimes rebuked people for asking him about it,
hmm.
in the sense that he found them impudent, not able to discern what is proper to say and what must remain unsaid, or is for more secluded occasions, let's say. So,
and would you say in that context that it's because Ivan didn't want to have his faith being brought at the forefront because it might affect his ideas or what he was trying to bring forth with his ideas, his concept, his books? Would you say that this could be part of it, of why you didn't want to bring those questions to the forefront?
well, he was a parish priest. He was ordained in 1951. He became a parish priest in northern Manhattan in Washington Heights. That was a relatively brief period in his life, for 4 years. Um, but he remained a priest until he remained an active priest until 1969. He never renounced his priesthood. He just stopped exercising it. He said suspended. Um, so, and all that time, he explicitly preached what he called a new church, right? Most explicitly in a wonderful essay called "The Vanishing Clergyman," right? In which he imagines a declericalized church, which is not an easy thing to do. I mean, the clerisy is not incidental to the present existing church. So he thought about, yes, what this new church would be, and he wasn't. After In 1968, he was summoned to the Vatican by the Holy Office, subjected really to a latter-day Inquisition, which he refused to cooperate with. The Vatican put a ban on the center he then operated in Cuernavaca, Mexico, which was a kind of, by then, expanding into almost what you'd call an alternative university.
That's right.
He said, enough. I will stop representing the church because this is sterile and not good for anybody. So after he began to write books like Celebration of Awareness, Deschooling Society, Tools for Conviviality, Energy and Equity, Limits to Medicine or Medical Nemesis, all of which came out in a rush between 1970 and 1975, 76, he wrote as what? He wanted to make it plausible to people that Western societies were crossing a watershed into what he called counterproductivity.
Mm-hmm.
But he meant a situation of such total artificiality, right, that it would be utterly mystifying and confusing to live in it.
Yes.
And might become a situation, as he warns in Tools for Conviviality, with no exit, right?
Mm.
So the presumption of schools, of medicine, of all our technologies in a certain way, in as much as all our technologies are constantly telling us who we are, as that was Ivan's way of, Illich's way of putting it, right? Was we ask, what can we do with a technique? But he wanted to ask, what does it say to us?
Mm.
What does it say to us about what and who we are? That could become a closed room. So he issued all these warnings without, if you read Deschooling Society carefully, he's constantly saying that this is a church. This is a new church.
Yes.
So he's not hiding the fact that he regards it as a transposition of a church, but he's not locating himself as a man of faith in saying this. He's saying, look at the actual consequences, right?
Yes.
And leaving moot, let's say, for the most part, the question until much later, and that was the work I did with him in the 90s, and became a book called The Rivers North of the Future, which is published 3 years after his death in 2005, in which he laid out for me in a series of talks exactly how he saw the connection between the life, death, and resurrection of the Christ and the church and the society that eventually emerged.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't say much about that during his career because he wanted to insist that this is a historical issue for all people, right?
Yeah.
You don't. It may be that faith, Christian faith specifically, enables you to see something about it that you wouldn't otherwise see. He didn't deny that. But he said that all can see what needs to be seen, right?
Yeah.
Which is where this has ended, or where it's ending, since we live now in a kind of permanent ending, right?
Or a permanent unfolding, as we wish to see it.
Well, yes, that's not denying that there'll be a further unfolding, but for now, the time of the end looks like forever,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's everything is pushed as far as it will go,
Yeah.
right?
There's a force of contraction, it seems.
If you look at the government of Canada, it's constantly straining at its limits. It
Yeah.
wants to spend way more than it can raise by taxing us because there's so much it needs to do. It has to fix this. It has to fix that. It has to fix everything.
Exactly.
And every situation, and the majority of people believe that the seas are going to boil within a century, or the majority of the people I know believe that.
Yes.
So that's an extreme. I don't personally believe it, but that's an extreme example of this pushing the limits, and therefore having entered, the time of the end, which is the end, which the end that goes on forever.
Exactly.
It's and Ivan warned about this in I keep calling him Ivan, I should say Illich, but when I first knew him, I invited him to a teach-in in Toronto in 1970 with some friends, and I were putting on this teach-in, and he took as his theme the recently released picture of the Earth in space.
Mm.
It wasn't from the first moon landing, but it was from later, and it was this image which is now trite and almost desensitizing. Right? Everybody's got it on their T-shirt. But he said, well, you can look at that, and the two ways open for you. One is, I'm putting words in his mouth to be brief, the way of repentance. The second is we can manage this thing, right? We can enclose it in a net of controls so perfect that we'll be able to go on as we are, but somehow reduce our carbon footprint or put up enough windmills or whatever the hell it is to keep going like this. And that's what we're in. We're going to keep going, right? Maybe it's going to be AI now, or maybe we can edit fetuses so they won't have any difficulties, or maybe it's medical assistance in dying, right? Which Canada is the world leader seemingly in embracing, right? Yeah. All these things raise questions. They all raise the question of who we are.
Exactly.
What we are, and yet they all press ahead, right? They all seem unstoppable.
Yeah.
So that's this curious time of the end that I'm talking about.
It seems like there's I have a feeling that Illich was seeing a pattern between all of these institutionalized process, whether it be the medical establishment, the education establishment, or even the nation state, and that somehow we can see that there is you talk about the end of times, we can see that there's kind of a eschatological um, agenda almost pushing through all of these different institutions for them to kind as you said, like kind of like uh, force into a kind of a bottleneck of that we could call hand, or like a threshold, or like, and the concept of threshold was really present also in Illich's work, where he was saying that institution can serve until they reach a certain threshold, and then they become counterproductive, if I'm
Right.
correct.
That's exactly right.
Exactly. And it feels like right now all of these are kind of like red flashing, like all the thresholds are kind of like in the red, and what we can do right now with all of this, when we're conscious about it, and we're conscious about the force that's kind of pushing humanity in this bottleneck situation, is we don't know what's coming, but it feels to me like what we can do is like stop and contemplate and ask these questions that you've just asked, who are we and what are we doing here? you know does that make sense?
Yes, I think that's exactly the right response.
Hmm. Slowing down.
Slowing down, asking questions,
Yeah.
breathing, right? Uh, do we intend to stay here? If we do, what are the conditions under which we can live
Exactly.
as human beings? So yeah.
There's a famous quote from Illich who says that future is a man-eating idol, right?
Yes.
And it's kind of like when I think about the agenda of development, and this kind of like pushing humanity towards the bottleneck, it feels like this is like aligning ourselves with a certain future. Are you following me on this one?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it feels to me like you mentioned when the Illich renounced his priesthood, he was operating an alternative university in Cuernavaca. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that when that happened, he was starting to become more of a voice, a critical voice towards the notion of development, just like Robert Vachon and Panicard were
Yes.
in the same years with the Intercultural Institute of Montreal. And it seems like this is the sacred cow of the development agenda, is the sacred cow that you cannot touch. You cannot touch this myth. And it seemed to me like Illich was called, as you said, to the Vatican because they didn't want him to go there. Is that an accurate view?
Well, it is generally quite true what you said, but there were he specifically alienated a strong right-wing Catholicism in Mexico. So there were specific forces agitating against him within the church, and he enjoyed the protection of a very strong archbishop who was himself somewhat on the right at times. He blessed the bombers that flew missions to Vietnam, but he was very loyal and he loved Ivan, and he was very loyal to him. So he was protected until Spellman died in '67, and then the forces against Illich and the church mobilized. So it was specific, but yes, he had been specifically subverting the missionary effort of the church in Latin America. This had been a big thing since the mid-50s, and 3 popes had expressed their support for this idea that the American church should send really massive missionary forces to Latin America. I mean, the goal, it never was achieved, was 10% of the strength, the person power of the American church, to be sent to Latin America. And he raised the issue of whether this is an evangelical enterprise or an attempt to prop up the Latin American hierarchy that, so it could concentrate on supporting the juntas in Chile and Brazil and elsewhere. So he was very outspoken against the church's involvement with the Alliance for Progress, with development, with conventional developmental thinking. Yeah.
What would be the connection between there's a strong movement in Latin America around the theology of liberation, which is kind of like mostly using the gospel and to empower the grassroots, the people. And what would be the correlation? Would you say that this is what triggered the right wing leaning church members towards Illich? Is affiliation with...
Well, life is full of misunderstandings, as you know, and everyone knows. And Ivan was generally taken as part of liberation theology, but which he absolutely wasn't. Although he convened the first meeting that led to what became called liberation theology. And he was in dialogue with some of the theologians that became best known, Leonardo Boff and others. He actually disassociated himself from liberation theology because he believed that the gospel had to be very strictly kept separate from worldly affairs. Which is a traditional view, but obviously not the view of liberation theology. So he wasn't. So he was in a way quite at odds with that movement, but in a way that's subtle, that you would have to really be careful. Yeah. Okay, I have no idea. I just suddenly couldn't see you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Okay. So I was just saying that, that's a sidetrack about David Martin, a wonderful writer. But
yes, you were talking about how the church kind of like, on one hand, holds the keys, literally the papal symbol, to these ideas of transcendence and like our human, some of the most precious keys to our questions about who we are, where we come from. We can think about the Vatican vault, what's in there, for instance, all the answers we could find. And on the other hand, it kind of like also has the lock, and it's kind of like imposing itself as a kind of like a monopoly on truth, and it's kind of a mediator,
Yes.
So if I get it correctly, this is what
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I learned from David Martin is that's a protective function, right? It's a socially protective function.
As in, humanity is not ready to have all of these answers? Is that...
Well, the example that comes to mind, it was David's example, is that circumcision is a ritual of belonging and identification, right? We do this to our people. and the ones who have this done to them are one of us, right? Baptism is not like that, right? As the church originally proposes it. Baptism is for anyone and only the one who believes, who accepts, who chooses it. Well,
out of their own free will.
So you know what happened to baptism? It became a form of circumcision, right? It became what a community did to show that this was one of ours. And that's David's example of how the church turns or holds at bay the revolutionary side of the gospel in order to engage in the preservation, the maintenance, the passing on of community, which is antipathetic to the revolutionary message of the gospel. Or a better way to say it is that it's complementary, right? That these are the inevitable two sides of our living, right? So we talked earlier about Ivan saying, know the difference. Keep the gospel free of this entanglement, right? Don't take it as prescriptive as it was taken, right? So that he was fighting against American mission in Latin America, which rather than being dedicated to finding out what does the gospel mean in this new setting, they had a whole plan. They had a whole program, right? The gospel's part of the American way of life, and so on. So, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts, David, about we could say the rising up of Orthodox Church right now? I'm thinking about there's a man from Quebec called Jonathan Pajot who's became a good friend with Jordan Peterson in the recent years.
Yeah.
And also about the rising interest, with Eastern churches. For in Russia, we can see the president, doing the baptism ritual and like doing the cross sign, and like it seems like there is kind of or even this preacher getting stabbed in Sydney recently. Like it seems like there is something in the egregore about Orthodox Church doing a kind of a rebirth, while maybe the Western Vatican-led churches are kind of like on their decaying final chapter. Does that make sense? Do you have any comments on this?
I don't. I have friends who are Orthodox, but I'm scarcely knowledgeable enough to say anything about it. Except that I stay with what I've been given, and I think Illich is inviting a reconsideration of the gospel altogether, so that it isn't just that. I think to say Western Christianity or Latin Christianity bad, Eastern Christianity good, we've gone back to the first millennium now. We've solved the problem. I'm not too sure about that. But as I say, I know little about the Orthodox Church. So,
yeah, it seems like that would be an oversimplification. It's not what I was trying to say, like divided between good and bad. Seems like there's integration to happen in both of them, and as you say, maybe a form of reconciliation. And I wanted to give this talk the title of Resurrecting Ivan Illich, in that spirit of it seems like there is a lot, like my generation, like a new generation that's kind of enjoining maybe your generation, and kind of maintaining this man's spirit and his ideas and what he was embodying alive. I'm thinking about I've seen your interview with Justin Murphy and Nina Power. I'm thinking about his French biographer, also Jean-Michel Dijon, and another woman, Babette Babiche, she's a scholar who has a group, also kind of a research group on Ivan Illich.
Yeah.
And how do you explain this kind of like perennial or renewed interest that you have been, blessed to kind of be a flame for, also, and a catalyzer, and around his ideas and around even his personality? Because it seems like he was embodying, like, once you love Illich, it seems like there's something that goes beyond even his ideas. It's like we kind of embrace the man. Does that make sense? You have this feeling?
Well, I do. Yeah. And obviously I was part of that.
Of course, yes.
Without meaning to be part of it or knowing what it was at the time. But I think, you can't say better than Giorgio Agamben. Agamben, the Italian philosopher, said that Illich was reaching the hour of his legibility, borrowing a phrase from Walter Benjamin. And I think that must be true, right? That he was not, he had a vogue, certainly. I mean, he was immensely celebrated and known and made much of, and prime ministers wanted to speak to him in the early 1970s. But I don't think it was well understood what he was saying, right? And perhaps, nobody really knew how to do it, right? De-school society, rein in the medical system, right? Build a convivial society where you actually recognize that certain tools are inherently destructive and you don't want them. You just say no to them. Yeah. This was, I think the situation had to proceed farther before anyone would, before a larger number, before, I don't know how to say this. Lots of us at the time felt this was right?
Yeah.
But the moment passed, the 60s were in a way reconceived, right, as the heyday of the boomers, right? So it got a demographic interpretation. It got an interpretation of something in the history of style. Pretty soon, all these intergenerational competitions were set up. So it was the boomers against the Xers and the Xers against the Zers and all this crazy stuff, right? That worked to hide the idea that this had been a moment of historical opening, right?
A kairos.
A kairos, a revolutionary moment, not seized, or seized in the wrong way often, right?
Yeah.
And to me, Illich is part of that, right? In the same way that Fritz Schumacher is part of it, or Dietrich Bonhoeffer is part of it, right? It was. I said before, for me, Carl Jung is part of that as well, right?
Even the French May 68 and the Situationist movement, Guy Debord, Society of Spectacle. It was like something was happening at the end of the 60s, right?
Yes. Yeah, and I think fundamentally, it's the recognition that a new age must begin.
Yes, a new story.
But it's nice. At the time, you're thinking, well, maybe by next week. And even in some of Ivan's headier utterances from the early 70s, you have the impression that he believes, or that he at least is trying to believe, that deschooling is imminent, right? It's any day now, kind of, which is funny to read now. Except you can interpret it as saying, well, we did get deschooling uh, in the sense that we got radical disillusionment with the project, while at the same time deeper deeper investment in it, right, as the only available road for my children, right?
Yes.
I want them to get ahead. Um,
So, friends, that was part one of my interview with the good-hearted man David Cayley, and author and friends of Ivan Illich. And I promise to myself to be in touch again soon with David to continue the conversation around Illich's vision and idea, which I believe are crucial and necessary in our time of kairos, of an opportunity right now that's available for humanity to, yeah, evolve, grow. So subscribe and stay in touch for the next part on Resurrecting Illich.